Unit 5 in 8th grade is, metaphorically speaking, reading nonfiction like a cognitive linguist. Now, in 6th and 7th grade, students would have gone through units called Reading Like a Detective, and we take a different approach in this unit as we get to think about language and how it works and how it affects the ways we see the world around us. When you look at the introduction to the unit, you'll see a quick overview, and you'll see that we have a few goals here. We want students to recognize that metaphors are all around us, and they're not just things that show up in poetry or a certain kind of writing. They actually shape how we think and interact with the world around us, and they both highlight things about the subject and they can hide things about a subject. Metaphors are very powerful. To get a quick overview of the unit, we can look at the table of contents and see that it's divided into 3 parts. The first part introduces students to the ideas of metaphorical thinking. They get to view 2 different people presenting on this topic as a way to introduce it and to get thinking about how metaphors show up around us and in our language. And they practice some of the thinking with that. They search for metaphors around them and examine the effects they have. In part 2, students read a text by Verlyn Klinkenborg, several short sentences about writing. And they're looking at the argument he makes about the metaphors we use for writing, especially the idea of flow. They unpack his claims about that, and they think about the importance of metaphor and how we think about the things we do. And then they look at a selection by Ann Patchett. She's writing about her own writing, and they examine the metaphors she uses. And they think about the effect that those have on the reader, and also about what Klinkenborg would think about the metaphors she uses. So with parts 1 and 2 done, students then examine their own metaphorical thinking. And in the culminating task of this unit, they are writing about an activity that they especially enjoy or love to do, and they are beginning to transform that writing through the use of metaphor. They're choosing a visual metaphor to really express something significant about that activity to the reader. And in the final part of that task, they analyze their own metaphor to think about what it reveals about the subject and what it hides about the subject. You'll want to plan ahead for a few things. In particular, you'll want to think about trying your own model essay about an activity you love. You'll want to try out some of this metaphorical writing so that you can have something to share with students, and so you can talk about your own process for walking through that when you get to session 12. There are other elements. You'll want to think ahead about some of the writing tasks and the rubrics you'd like to use with that, and you'll want to collect some visual metaphors ahead of session 5, and that will make sense as you're going through the first few sessions. I'll take a moment to talk through a few of the sessions in the unit. Now, in this first one, we're going to introduce the unit itself and some of the ideas about cognitive linguists that will be important for the unit. The first thing students do, though, is write about an activity that they love to do. We want students to do this before we've actually introduced much of the unit, so that they've got something that is down on paper sort of before we even think about metaphor or get into the big topics there. We'll get to play with that essay later and have students revise it and change it in some different ways later in the unit. So it's important that they do it here, but it's not important that it be a perfect final draft of anything here. We're getting ideas down, we're starting to think about an activity that we love to do and what we would want to say about it. Now, none of your students will have heard of cognitive linguistics. So in the work period of session 1, we're introducing the idea of linguistics in general as the study of language, and we talk about how different people study language for different purposes. We can think about forensic linguists, sociolinguists, and different roles that people take with this. But in particular, we're going to begin looking at cognitive linguists, who are looking at the relationship between language and thought. And students get to read through a quote about this topic and unpack it as a way of thinking about how language can shape our views of the world almost before we're even aware of it. In these first 2 sessions, they then view a couple presentations from cognitive linguists who are presenting to the audience in a pretty approachable way their ideas about metaphor and thought. And we explore that with students and unpack several of those. That's session 1 and session 2. In session 3, we get to have some more discussion about that. And we get to introduce the metaphors in everyday life task. So for this task, students are asked to begin looking for metaphors all around them. That can be metaphors that show up in conversation, metaphors that show up in song lyrics, metaphorical language that shows up in advertisements, in anything they see online. They're everywhere once you start looking for them. And you as the teacher will want to collect a few examples of visual metaphors before session 5 so you can share those with students. In session 4, we continue examining how metaphors show up in everyday language and how they shape the way we think about certain topics. So the example here would be time is money or life is a journey. How do these metaphors give rise to a lot of our ideas about money and about how we should navigate our lives? Even saying the words navigate our lives embeds the idea that life is a journey. It's something that we navigate. So in the metaphors are all around us task, students are looking through examples from different quotes. You can always find new quotes and different things. You can pull these from any other topic as well. But students think about the idea that's actually being written about. They identify the metaphor that's being used there. And they think about how that metaphor might influence how we act or think about the subject. After wrapping that up, we move to part 2, studying metaphorical thinking and writing. And we read Verlyn Klinkenborg's several short sentences about writing. In brief, he makes an argument that we should not think about writing as flow, that talking about it in that way is not true to begin with. And because it is not true, it is potentially harmful to young writers who are attempting this work and thinking that it should feel like flow. So he has an argument that he's making in his work. And after students unpack that and work through those ideas in a couple sessions, they read how Ann Patchett writes about her own writing process. So her essay, Why Not Put Off Till Tomorrow, the novel you could begin today, was published in the New York Times. And I think it's fair to say that she does not think of writing primarily as a process that feels like flow. Students examine some of the different metaphors that she uses in her writing about writing. And they think about what's highlighted by that and why it's effective or interesting. I also want to mention, while this is not an explicit focus of these sessions right here, it's a really good thing to highlight with students that writing does not always feel like flow. So just like students sometimes feel like reading should always be easy, and if they're a good reader, they will just automatically understand things, and then they get frustrated when they don't. They feel like they're a bad reader and they can shut down because of that. It's the same thing with writing. Writing, they believe, should be easy for people who are good writers. So it's important to recognize that writing is never especially easy. Even professional, award-winning writers write about writing as being a challenging process, one that is always requiring effort from them, where they're constantly working and revising in an effort to get down exactly what they intend to say. So writing is challenging for everyone. And so it's okay for students to feel like writing is difficult for them because frankly, writing is difficult for everybody. After looking at how Ann Patchett writes about writing and examining that and thinking about what Klinkenborg would say about that as well, students get to return to their own piece of writing. So for the culminating task, we return to the piece of writing they did at the very beginning of the unit, something I love to do. And in this case, they now develop a piece of writing about 2 or 3 pages describing what it feels like to engage in this activity that they love to do. And now they're specifically thinking about metaphors that help convey important things about that activity. So they can pull some of these metaphors maybe from what they wrote earlier. They can think about incorporating new ones. It can be a particular extended metaphor, or it can be several shorter metaphors. But the idea of metaphor should influence their writing and should help them revise that earlier piece into something a little more polished and thoughtful in how it is put together. That's the first part of the final assignment. The second part is an analysis of it, where students look back at their writing and examine the metaphors they chose to use, and they write about what those metaphors highlight and help a person see, and what they might conceal or what they might prevent a reader from seeing about the subject. So the next several sessions are all dedicated to drafting and revising those two parts of the task. There are elements of peer review incorporated through that. And in session 16, students have an opportunity to share their writing and their metaphors with one another. You can do that in different ways. So it's possible for you to set this up through an online process where students post their final projects and students can review them online. Or students can do a gallery walk, share them, present them. There are multiple ways of approaching that. But as always, we close in this final session with a chance to reflect on the unit itself. And we always want to emphasize the significance of some of these closing reflections where we think about why metaphor matters, what we learned in this unit, how we will carry that learning forward with us. It's a great unit, and it's also one that's wonderful to get student samples of. So if you go through this and you have any student samples to share back with us, we would love to get them, and you can find our contact information on the website. That is Metaphorically Speaking for 8th grade.